The Prime Minister's been very keen to spruik his green credentials since coming to office and scored a significant win last week when his climate bill passed through Parliament. But it's not enough, according to those living in some of the most vulnerable corners of our region. Our Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedget spoke to two former Pacific Island presidents, Anote Tong and Tommy Remengesau, a short time ago.
Well, gentlemen, thank you both very much for speaking to the ABC while you're in Canberra. Let's start with a slightly broader brush question. Even today, with disasters mounting, people still sometimes talk about climate change in the abstract as something that will happen in the future rather than something that's obviously happening now. I wonder if you could both paint a brief picture for me. What are the impacts that climate change are already happening in both of your respective homelands? Perhaps, Mr. Tong, if we start with you talking about Kiribati.
Well, it's got to be understood that we live in very low-lying island countries. Atolls, by their very geography, are barely two meters above sea level. Very narrow strips of land, and therefore very vulnerable to any kind of severe weather. We are getting the tides, the king tides, on virtually every occasion. When they come, they're always coming over the top. I spoke to my wife this morning, and with the full moon, the front of my house was washed out, and so we have to bring in material again in order to cover it up. But that is happening frequently. When it happens on a wider basis, it overtopping of the waves onto the land destroys the waterlands, food crops. When it gets more severe, it destroys homes. And so this is what we have been experiencing. Now we have some communities who have had to relocate because they can no longer stay in their former village. And so that is happening, and of course the impacts are getting worse as we watch them over the years, now decades that we have been, for me, it's been a couple of decades since I started this campaign, and I have seen a change and much more severe impacts.
How about Palau, sir? Obviously a less low-lying nation in parts than Kiribati, but still a country enormously vulnerable to climate change. Can you describe the impacts you're seeing in Palau?
So this is a united message that we all bring, we do bring from the Pacific. As we speak, the sea level rise is a real thing. It's destroying crops and plantations. It's making people relocate to higher grounds. There's the issue of stormy weathers, unpredictable these days. So you get typhoons, earthquakes. There's the ocean acidification, coral bleaching, El Nino and La Nina impacts. All these are happening as we're here in Australia, and so it becomes an existential threat. It's a survival threat, and that's why our message is it's a security issue for us.
Now, the new Labor government, or newish Labor government, has won a measure of credit from Pacific states for ramping up short-term ambition. But Pacific Island nations have also been clear that the government needs to take a hard look at its responsibility for coal and gas exports and the way that those exports are driving climate change. The government argues that in the end, fundamentally, it's not responsible for the fact that these projects depend on Australian coal and gas. In the end, these are decisions made overseas, not in Australia. What's your response to that argument?
Well, it's Australia cannot absolve itself of the responsibility because it's selling. It's not giving it away. It's selling and benefiting by it. And the export of coal, especially, and of course gas to a lesser extent, will continue to drive emission levels up wherever they are burnt, whether in Australia or overseas. They will drive up emission levels, with it global temperatures, and with it sea level rise. And so these are definitely detrimental to the future of our people.
The argument sometimes made is, well, for example, when it comes to coal, perhaps Indonesian coal would just be substituted if Australia were to stop exporting dirtier coal. That would have a more damaging impact over time. What's your response to that?
Well, we're looking at it this way. We all have a moral responsibility to do the right thing. And so it's not just about economical considerations and industry considerations. it should be about the right thing to do. And for us, the Pacific it's a survival issue. It's life and death. So whether it's being used here in Australia or exported, the net impact of that is that we are on the brunt. We are on the front line of what's happening in the real world. And so we're trying to say, please, let's stop the causes of climate change because we are hurting.
What do you think are the chances of Australia being able to host a COP, a conference of the parties, a UN conference in, say, 2025, as it's proposed to do with the Pacific under the current policy settings? Do you think it's likely that Pacific Island leaders will say it's not really realistically a prospect whilst you continue to open new coal and gas projects? Or do you think it's unlikely that they'd make that demand? Perhaps Mr. Tong first.
Well, definitely the case. I think we know, and Australia knows that unless it can step up its commitment to climate action, it will not have the qualification to host a meeting like that. And of course, it's not about the Pacific Island countries being a part of hosting the conference of the parties, but it's about cutting emissions. And if Australia will host the COP, but at the same time continues to export coal and gas, then obviously these are a contradiction. And we have delivered this message to the government. And we understand that it may take time for the government to readjust its priorities, but until the Australia can relook at those areas, it's going to be difficult for the Pacific Island countries to believe that Australia is truly committed to cutting emissions and thereby saving the future generations of Pacific Island countries.
All right. Well, thank you both, gentlemen, for your time. I appreciate you speaking to the ABC.
Okay. And thank you for speaking to us. Thank you.